Okay, let's do it.
All right. Hello and welcome to Talk Flock 3. I'm Jerry.
And I'm Anna. Every 2 weeks or so, we invite two friends from various fields to give a brief but brilliant talk online on topics of their choosing.
These talks can be scripted or unscripted,
Lecture or performance.
about anything or nothing at all.
Our goal is to let people and ideas meet in this digital non-space.
And seek new possibilities for encounter, wonder, serendipity, and engagement.
Tonight, our talkers are Alex Tatarsky and Cecil Howell, and they'll each deliver 20-minute talks.
After which we'll open up the floor for Q&A and discussion.
And we do hope the discussion gets lively. This is your digital space as much as it is ours.
We'll listen, talk, maybe disagree a bit, maybe figure some things out.
Maybe spiral into deep, productive confusion together.
Fingers crossed.
So I know that we have gathered from different places. We've got Appalachia, Boston, New York. That's all I can think of on the screen right now. But I'd like to acknowledge that Jerry and I and a couple other people on this call are speaking to you from the unceded land of the Lenape people. Can we all take a breath together to offer acknowledgement and deep gratitude to these people and to this land? We would not be here today without the genocide and systematic exclusion of Indigenous peoples. Thank you. This acknowledgement is just a first step towards a lifelong fight to dismantle the legacy of settler colonialism and white supremacy. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anna. So a couple of points of Zoom etiquette before we begin. First, please keep yourself muted during the talks and the discussion portion unless you yourself are talking. Even a little bit of background noise can mess up the sound for everybody. Second, video is optional. It's lovely to see your lovely faces, but no pressure to be on camera. Third, we are recording tonight's session for archival purposes. Please feel free to turn off your video if that makes you uncomfortable and reach out to me or Anna if that worries you for any reason. Fourth, this is the chat box. We invite discussion in here as well as over the microphone. Feel free to use it as you see fit. And so that does it for preliminary things. It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce the great Cecil Howell, who is our first talker today. Cecil is, aside from being a fierce ping pong player who using a sort of rope-a-dope strategy of constant dancing motion really brings quite a bit of enthusiasm and energy into ping pong matches. Cecil is also, when I was thinking today about the best word to describe Cecil, it is a biophiliac, which perhaps is not even a word, but as in somebody who really loves life. And I mean that both in terms of her energy, her exuberance, whether that is on a hike or playing aforementioned ping pong, but also in terms of the life of the critters around us. Cecil has an almost unbridled enthusiasm and capacity for attention to what might be something that you would overlook is something that Cecil would look at quite closely for quite a long time, whether that's a tide pool full of tadpoles or the patterns of lichen on a rock. Cecil finds meaning and joy in this attention, which makes her an absolute pleasure to hike with and informs her very interesting visual art practice, which is often engaged with themes of ecology, interconnectedness, interspecies communication and thought. She's also a landscape architect with her own architecture firm, Object Plus Field, which is really very cool. So she's going to be talking tonight, and please join me in welcoming Cecil Howell.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. Rope-a-dope is such a good word. I don't know if it is a word, but I love it. Thank you both to Anna and Jerry for hosting this. It's so fun to have these moments to share creativity and get to hear from everybody. And I'm sorry, Elena, because you've already experienced the talk I'm about to give, but hopefully I'll make it slightly different this time for you. So as Jerry was saying, I'm a landscape architect and visual artist. After 9 years of working for landscape architecture firms, I found myself kind of limited by the ways that landscape architecture is practiced. It's a discipline focused on building the physical world, yet so many of the issues that we face today need to be addressed in the human imagination. So to give myself the freedom to explore these issues, I created a studio, which is equal parts visual art, research, and landscape architecture. And as part of this new practice, I've started creating these hybrid narrative/visual essays where the visuals are not necessarily illustrative of the text, but rather means of exploring sort of the more ambiguous or enigmatic elements of the essay. So I'm going to present one of these essays to you tonight. I'll be reading the text and flipping through the images at the same time. And then after I'm reading, we can go back and look at the images in more depth if you'd like, and I can speak to some of the particulars. So with that said, let me share my screen. Great. Can everybody see something? Great. Okay. So this is a piece I did for a magazine called Burnaway. They're based in Atlanta. They're a great arts and cultural magazine that one of our fellow McDowell people edits. To begin. On February 25th, 2020, the Honorable Eugene E. Seiler heard the closing arguments from the states of Tennessee and Mississippi regarding a dispute over who owns the groundwater in the Middle Claiborne Aquifer, one layer in the larger Mississippi embayment aquifer system, a mushy layer cake of rocks and water that spreads underneath 7 states. Judge Seiler will send his recommendations on the ruling to the Supreme Court, making this the first groundwater case ever ruled on by our nation's highest court. While surface water use disputes are common, particularly in the arid West, this case is conceptually striking as it begs us to imagine ancient waters flowing below our terra firma, beneath our farms and cities, fashioning us as flotsam on this slushy substrate. While the cartographic boundaries of our states are often revealed as absurd by the landscape, imagine orthogonal lines slicing up a watershed into a jigsaw of bureaucracy, the invisibility of the aquifer upends our understanding of state sovereignty and commodification as its waters slowly move below state lines, evading easy classification and possession. Translating complex systems such as aquifers into policy guidelines requires editing out nuances and drawing averages. This loss of intricacy occurs as one converts system to science and science to policy, which is then further warped by the intersections of history and culture. Compared to the complexity of reality, the language and laws we use to describe water appear alternately as humorous, poetic, or absurd. In Mississippi versus Tennessee, hydrological and geological experts testified for both sides, bringing their detailed knowledge of aquifers to bear upon the case. As court proceedings are recorded in text, the visuals that were presented to support the oral arguments were described in detail by these experts, adding another layer of distortion as image is rendered into word. These collages are my own interpretations of the phantom visuals and terms presented by the experts and lawyers on both sides of the case. The work is not an attempt to articulate anything factual or a winning argument, but rather draw out the ambiguities of the case using the language of law and the properties of paint to explore the paradoxes and limits inherent to borders and ownership, especially when it comes to water. Now, it may seem strange to talk about water shortages in a region known for its abundance, but what aquifers have that streams and rivers lack is a built-in purifying system and very easy accessibility. All you have to do is drill down. These hidden sources of clean water used for both farming and drinking are quickly becoming depleted. NASA believes that 21 of the 37 major aquifers in the world are running a deficit, with 25 to 40% of the world's population relying on groundwater as its primary drinking source. This presents a serious problem. In Mississippi, the aquifer that farmers use for irrigation is declining by 1 to 1.5 feet a year, setting the stage for water shortages, farming failures, and legal battles. Unlike a mountain or river, which are defined by the height or the flow rates, an aquifer is a rock or sediment layer capable of transmitting usable quantities of water. In other words, it's a commodity. The entire case of Mississippi versus Tennessee rests on the question of whether this invisible commodity is owned by whichever state it is under, or if it is an interstate resource and therefore governed, like many rivers, by the law of equitable apportionment, where each state is granted fair usage rights. Armed with the most basic knowledge of osmosis, it's hard to imagine how one state could assume ownership of groundwater, especially in an aquifer. But to some extent, I think that is the state of Mississippi's point. How do we carve up a system that is so interconnected? The unit of an aquifer may appear as a tangible object, but it is, as so many experts testified, connected to the aquifers above and below it, the surface water streams, oceans, and ultimately the clouds above us. The arbitrary divisions of state lines have served as borders for many a complex system, so why not this one as well? What is striking to me upon reading through these court documents is that by claiming to own the water, Mississippi loses its ability to present an argument about fair usage. In doing so, the city of Memphis can continue to actively promote the fact that it has the sweetest water in the world, delivered at half the cost of much of the country. This promise of cheap and clean water has attracted biotech and beverage companies whose use of water will, of course, eventually impact Mississippi even more. The 19th century geologist and geographer, John Wesley Powell, who led the first American government-sponsored passage through the Grand Canyon, took a prescient view on water issues in the West. By understanding how the limitations of water would affect farming, he forecasted the environmental havoc of the Dust Bowl. He saw the bigger picture and asked those around him to adapt to the realities of the environment rather than plow through them. The industrial titans of the 19th century ignored him, preferring profit and power, and so the same issues still face us today, merely complicated by the intervening decades of use and patchwork of subsequent laws. What is the best way to demarcate boundaries and govern water? Should a soda company be able to profit from cheap, clean water filtered by the soil of a neighboring state? How do we ensure a clean water source for the future? By skirting these questions, we only delay the broader repercussions of an already mounting crisis. As Powell famously said, "Gentlemen, you are piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights, for there is not sufficient supply to supply the land. There's not sufficient water to supply the land." So that was my little essay, and then I can kind of just walk you through these images a little bit more. And if anybody wants to jump in at any point, that's also fine too. But these were basically, I was reading these transcripts of the court documents, and I found a lot of the language that the experts were using really fascinating and enticing, and I wanted to somehow kind of combine those with these images of water moving. And so I made, each of these are monoprints, so I use a plastic surface and combine different pigments and materials and kind of move water around them, or use ice melting, and then I make prints from them. And a lot of these have been digitally manipulated as well. But I basically wanted to take the language that they were using and some of the experts' text, and then pair them with these images to just highlight this really strange way that we have to, how limited our language is in describing these really complex systems, and not even just our language, but our laws as well. And some of these were from other projects as well. I kind of picked a lot of different graphics that I've created over the years and combined them into these. I loved this line, one man's confining layer is another man's aquifer, because it stated to me kind of the whole sum of this thing where they're trying to, the confining layer is the thing that goes around the aquifer that creates its border. But of course, some people are getting water from the confining layer as well. So it becomes very nebulous once you start to get into the details of what an aquifer is. And a lot of the experts, and maybe I'm projecting this on them, but it certainly felt like they didn't want to give the answers that the lawyers were asking them to give, that they saw the complexity and wanted people to know what that complexity was. And so this line, the maps or the generalization, they kept trying to reinforce that of course, these systems are way more complicated than what we see on a map. And that we're always trying to draw out these averages, but in fact, what is the reality is it's way more intense and muddy. Water is cake. It was just a good line. That's all I got on that one. The dinosaurs walking, I mean, they also had to go back so far in time to explain how the Mississippi embayment had happened. And basically, the Mississippi River is the remnant of this giant valley that used to exist there. And this one scientist just articulated this incredible scene where there's barrier reefs and dinosaurs walking. And it was just so beautiful to think that that's how they see the landscape, that the rest of us are just looking at in its current context. This is like, it's me being slightly sarcastic because they always were saying there's some level of uncertainty in terms of every statement that they were making. The hypothetical water flow, there was a lot of conversations. Something that was really interesting that I didn't really get to in the text was that the water moves very slowly under the state line, and everybody agrees on that. But Mississippi was arguing that it moves so slowly that it's really in Mississippi. And Tennessee was arguing that because it moves at all, it's a shared resource. And I just thought it was so funny to think of like a person, how slowly you would have to move going across a border that you never actually crossed it. that would be the sign that you are still always in Mississippi. And that's what they were trying to articulate. So this kind of muddy, messy thing. That the great truth machine was this idea of an auger going down into the earth, and that's the only way that you would actually ever find out exactly what's happening below you, because the rest of this is all based on these projections, based on geology maps and all of the different testing wells they have. And this is just the great line. The cone of depression is this term that they use to describe the effect that a water well has on the aquifer. So as you're drilling down, if you imagine the center line as the drill down, all the water around it is kind of going down to that point where it will be then sucked up, kind of like a straw creates a little bit of a cone of depression as well, or like when you drain your bath, that like whirlpool. And the question was like, how big is this cone of depression? But of course, if you understand osmosis, like it's infinite, really, right? So it's very hard to like understand the boundaries of these things. And there was a lot of debate as to how big the cones of depression are. I'm gonna skip this one. The golden triangle is another thing that there was a lot of argument about, which is how much water would have, in pre-development conditions, moved from Mississippi into Tennessee naturally. And it's fascinating that we always have to go back to this idea of pre-development conditions as this way to like check ourselves. It feels like we've imagined, it just feels like this way of like disconnecting our current culture from the land that we occupy, that there was like a time before and now there's us, instead of understanding us as part of it. Maybe we can talk about that more because it's something that I like to think about a lot. a flow path. This again was a lot of conversations about how water would move from one state to the next. And what was kind of interesting about that was that there were all these ways that it could move into Arkansas and then back into Tennessee. And that Mississippi then would say, well, that's not the problem that we're addressing right now. So it's the way that you have to frame these issues in such narrow ways. I guess it's for any lawyers on the call, they probably understand this better than me, but it feels like you're always like cleaving off another rational argument in order to frame your argument exactly to get the exact answer that you want to have. And then just started skipping through this because I realize I'm running out of time. This was this beautiful line that one of the experts quoted. And I'm going to read you the correct quote. He slightly misquoted it, but it's from a Mary Oliver essay. And she says, over and over in the butterfly, we see the idea of transcendence. In the forest, we see not the inert, but the inspiring. In water that departs forever and forever returns, we experience eternity, which I thought was really beautiful. And the fact that this water expert could just pull up a Mary Oliver poem in the middle of proceedings was also wonderful. Anyway, that's all I got.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cecil. That was fabulous. We want to take a little bit to open up if anybody has like clarifying questions. We're going to have like a broader open discussion after Alex's presentation, but if anybody has questions specifically for Cecil, things they'd like clarified or opened up a little bit before we move on.
I do. Cecil?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Jerry's mom.
Hi.
Hi. Two questions. First of all, how far in the court process did this case go, or do you know?
So this was the proceedings from the special master, who then is going to or has already submitted it to the Supreme Court. So they're waiting for the Supreme Court to weigh in on his recommendations.
And so what is the current law? Is there a current existing law of how they treat the water? You know, if they
not for groundwater. For rivers there is. So that's that idea of equitable apportionment, and that's been ruled on probably like a dozen times. And usually states will come up with some fair usage before it gets to the Supreme Court. But this case is the first time that the groundwater has made it to that place.
And secondly, I'm actually a little more familiar with aquifers than you believe, because I live on Long Island, and it's the main source of our water on Long Island are these aquifers. And one of the main concerns here on Long Island is the pollution of the aquifers. Like for instance, one of the largest polluters of aquifers are the believe it or not, golf courses, and all of the what do you call it? The things they do they put on the grass to keep the grass green, and the
right, all the fertilizers
and things like that. So were pollutants and things like that, did that come into any of the conversation in the transcripts about polluting the aquifers?
You know, it didn't as much. There are only a couple of locations where this particular aquifer is exposed to the surface. So unlike, I'm not actually sure about Long Island's aquifers at all, but the drinking water is coming from much further deep than the irrigation water is in this area. And so by the time a lot of that gets down into that aquifer, it's been filtered out. And there's just a couple of locations where those pollutants could directly crawl into there. But yes, it is. Sorry, this is my nephew, August. And
So it wasn't part of the legal discussion as to if one area was polluting and it might move down to another state or anything like that, the consequences of that?
No, they didn't really focus on that as much. It really was focused on who owns this water. That was their like fundamental question of it. Unless, as I was saying, like Mississippi sort of missed the moment to really argue for the fact that like some random soda company shouldn't be able to take their water. And because of that, they just framed it as, no, we own this thing. Whereas now, Tennessee can really advertise themselves and give away pretty cheap water to whatever companies want to come. And so I feel like that's a real, like, the essence of it is like, we should be talking about those larger issues rather than focusing on these kind of arbitrary borders. But that was not a part of the case.
I love your work, and I love the way you make such a difficult topic so accessible.
That's so nice. Thank you.
That's great. And we'll talk a little bit more with Cecil after Alex's presentation. Before that, any other clarifying questions?
All right, awesome. Let's move on to talk number 2, performed/presented by Alex Tatarsky. Alex has been a friend of mine since college. She's also an esteemed performance artist and clown and visual artist. And she's really good at finding really poetic typos, a really wonderful memory. And I'm not sure, Alex, if this is right, but I remember when you were the Russian house housing advisor or something. You were like the head of the Russian house in my college, and you threw this huge party for the Russian house, and there was a flag made of either cupcakes or cake that was like, felt like 10 feet by 20 feet. Like, it was like the biggest cake I'd ever seen of the Russian flag in my life. And maybe that memory was wrong because it's so long ago.
But right, cakes as well as sausages and cheese as well as jellos and bicycle parts.
Yeah, and it was the most incredible cake and most incredible flag I'd ever seen, ever. Because, yeah, in terms of flags, for sure. And there was a really great local Russian band that played. So that's my bio for Alex. She's done also many things and is very esteemed in many ways. And you can find out more about her if you go to her website, which we'll post in the email at the end of this. So please give a round of shakes for Alex. I can't wait to hear what you've got to offer us today.
Hi all, thank you so much for having me. So forgive me in advance I have not the most sophisticated facility with technology, so if things go awry, oh well. I am going to attempt to weave together several rather disparate strands of things I'm thinking about, so I appreciate the permissiveness of this forum to just kind of talk about things on my mind. Very happy to be talker number 2. Thank you to talker number 1 tonight, Cecil. And the things I'm going to touch on seem perhaps unrelated, but for me have been increasingly intertwined in ways that I hope maybe we can all tease out a bit more. I'm going to talk about encampments, clowns, compost, and the regulation of the American body in a sort of revisitation of a project that I'm calling Fear of the Disordered State. Here, now I have to understand the computer. I share my screen. Fear of the Disordered State on Clowns and Drugs in 2016, which I have crossed out and revisited on Clowns and Compost in 2020. So I began thinking through some of these issues in 2016, the year that I graduated from clown school. And as you may recall, 2016 was a very bad year for clowns, especially. So not as bad as this year for the clown community, but still pretty bad. That summer, exactly 4 summers ago now, there was a rash of evil clown sightings all across America. Clowns, I'm trying to share more stuff. Are you seeing it? No.
Share your screen again.
I think if the screen sharing is too discombobulating for me, I shall give up on it. Here's some scary clowns for you that might jog your memory. So people were reporting seeing these clowns lurking at the edges of schools and woods in particular, and the hysteria spread. In some towns in 2016 and 2017, wearing clown garb was banned altogether, an ordinance with obvious negative consequences for my field. And in 2016, as we know, there was a clown election, and then a clown was elected king, or at least that's what the media claimed, obsessed with making the connection between the politics of the time and the circus. If the crown prince was a clown prince, then where did that leave actual clowns whose parodic behavior and grotesque exaggeration now just looked like hyper-realism or method acting? These were the questions that plagued me as a young clown graduate in 2016. Just as I was setting out on the clown job market, the reputation of my field had been terribly sullied. An October 2016 poll showed that Americans were statistically more scared of clowns than of global warming and terrorism. Personal experience does tend to bear this out. When I tell people that I'm a clown, they try to hide it, but they are clearly shuddering. If the role of the jester is to destabilize power structures through carnivalesque reversals, then having a jester as president means that to do my job, I had to, in fact, get serious. So that's why I am being so serious. Why do Americans claim to find clowns so scary? Okay. I went to clown school in Kensington, Philadelphia, a neighborhood widely considered the epicenter of the opioid crisis in the US. Communities make their homes under the elevated railroad, whose tracks were laid during the golden age of the American circus, and whose presence facilitated its success, making possible the transport of clowns, acrobats, elephants, lions, ringmasters, ponies, sideshow freaks, and all the physical accompanying infrastructure across the nation. In August of 2017, I saw the first of several attempts to clean up these encampments, attempts which we see today now in cities all across the nation and in a more visible way, perhaps, with media coverage, as people continue to protest, to gather to protest the violence of the state. So it is in part because I am a clown by training, and I think everything has to do with me and with clowns, but the irrational fear of clowns and the banning of clowns and the irrational fear of unhoused people and the banning of unhoused people that coalesced in 2017 and has really only continued to grow, starting with this election of a tyrant pretending to be a jester, seems to stem from a much older American impulse to put out of sight those members of society whose very presence proves the failure of the society by pointing to these gross power imbalances and violent absurdities, to remove those people whose appearance is considered grotesque and deformed and whose way of being is considered sick and contagious, liable to spread at the edges of town like scary clowns. This association between the circus and politics has ancient origins in the Roman poet Juvenal's famous phrase, bread and circuses, suggesting that to deter the underclass from revolt, all they need is enough bread not to starve and some form of entertaining distraction. Strategic placating quiets any urge toward political uprising. The American circus clown, in particular, emerged alongside American democracy and both benefited from and lampooned the form. The first traveling circuses followed the exact same touring routes as political campaigns, so the campaign route actually laid the route for the circus. The first popular clown act was folk hero Billy Buttons, whose act is that he's trying to ride his horse to go vote, but he keeps getting tangled up in the reins, falls off, gets dragged along, and finally manages to sit tall atop his horse, only to go riding backwards in the wrong direction away from the polls. A scenario that we are still dealing with and is perhaps quite present for some of us. So this image of the bumbling, white-faced clown continues to be ubiquitous in American culture. The clowns of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s sold hamburgers and milk. Let's see if I can share this with you. And then things got more sinister. The clowns of the 80s looked like they were going to kill people. And this is this moment where the prototype of the American scary clown is kind of born, right? The 80s, stranger danger, the AIDS crisis, mass incarceration expands, the Reagan years. This is when scary clowns really come on the news in literature, movies, and art. And this is also the moment of the kind of aggressive explosion of the war on drugs, right? An all-out war on any kind of altered or disorienting state, intensified by racism, classism, fear of complexity in terms of ability and gender and sexual presentation. This is also the moment of the culture wars, right, which frame the deviant performance artist as the most dangerous money-sucking enemy of the state. The word clown possibly comes from the Greek kolon, meaning stilts, plus phobia, right? So coulrophobia is this term that also emerges in the 80s to describe fear of clowns. Fear of this stilt walker, the fear of any kind of exaggerated body that can loom in an off-balance way that might be in danger of falling. So it's really fear of witnessing a fall, fear of the ambiguous, fear of the tumble, the stumble. While the traditional clown reveals to us our foibles and hypocrisies and destabilizes clear distinctions between good and bad, that's kind of the clown's job. The scary clown cements distinctions between good and bad. The scary clown is clearly bad while clearly pretending to be good, right? So fear of clowns reflects a desire for clarity. Respite from uncertainty and chaos is found in judging and condemning and hating the clown, who represents ambiguity. Protection against this strange in-between presence, often of unclear race, gender, and ability, is found in hatred or claiming hatred, kind of performative hatred of the clown. A scary clown is just a violent person pretending to be a clown, right? A real clown might pretend to be other people, sometimes violent people, in order to undermine their authority. But a scary clown is just a creepy, murderous, perhaps deeply lonely creature pretending to be a clown. And the deception of the pasted on smile is what is so scary, the falsity of the grinning. Permanently grinning to hide the extent to which we really feel that something is not right here. Of course, the clown in chief could be said to fit the model of the American scary clown to a T, in that he positions himself as an outsider, mocking the elites when in fact he is solidly of the elite class. And the method is so confusing because he is a king wearing the mask of the king's jester. He dresses up as a fool in his own court. He is his own fool, so as to go on doing the work of protecting and strengthening, not dismantling the elite class. So the scary clown is scary because it's not really a clown. I know I'm starting to seem a bit deranged here defending the real clowns, but the scary clown merely looks like a clown. It wears the costume of the clown to get away with enacting horrific acts of violence. It betrays the liberatory possibilities of confusion and disorder. And the image of the white-faced American circus clown in particular holds a place of immense symbolic meaning and value for US fears and desires around altered and disordered states, both politically and chemically. Criminalization, right, is how the state tries to maintain control over who has the agency to alter their state and where and in what way. So in these cities' violent removal of the encampments, we see the city's fear of matter out of place. Disorder and its perceived danger, both to the individual body and to the social body, then serves to justify the regulation of large numbers of bodies through increased police presence, military intervention, and legal codes. That is, through the forces of law and so-called order that try to eliminate the encampments. Of course, this conversation, as we know, is often framed as a cleaning up. It's often framed in terms of health and care, that the encampments, in fact, endanger residents. The threat is framed as coming from the imagined violence of the encampments rather than the very concrete violence that created them: gentrification, industrialization, toxic construction sites, eviction, racist policing, and of course, continued lack of resources. There's also this sense of disgust that I've really been thinking about and wrestling with, and I think especially now, a sense of disgust that is being stoked around gathering at all, and the contagious, the fear of contagion, but also the possibilities of contagion in terms of ideas and the spreading of thought. Of course, goddess of the abject, Julia Kristeva, writes that the I is formed most elementarily in relation to food loathing. So vomiting a rotten item forms the self in opposition to it, expelling not only the food, but the part of the self which took the food in and perhaps wanted to. Bakhtin writes in his study of the carnivalesque that power structures are at essence organized around who gets to eat, drink, imbibe, what, where, and when, which is precisely what the clown traditionally mocks. The clown ridicules hierarchical power dynamics by which the few exert violent control over the many, deciding exactly what they can and cannot put in their bodies and how different bodies will be punished differently for their choices. I have no idea how much more time I have to ramble. Anna, what do you think?
You have at least 7 minutes.
7, great. How are you all doing in your little boxes? And I'm interested in how the radically embodied practice of the clown emerges from a long tradition linking intoxication and performance and sort of embracing different modes of getting at disorder. So the word satire itself is from the Greek satyr, which was a mythological nature deity with a penchant for getting drunk. A main plot in Commedia dell'arte sketches come when servant characters attempt to steal food and wine from their greedy masters. This is like the driving plot point of Commedia, is stealing food and wine from the masters. The bump on the main character Arlecchino's head is said to come from a drunken stumble amidst revelry. The desire for bodily satiation and intoxication and the attendant social disorder and disruption of class hierarchy that this entails are the driving narrative forces of popular folk comedy. The red nose that we think of with the hobo, right? The American circus clown type is said to indicate chronic alcohol use. So there's this association between joblessness, homelessness, and intoxication as a mirror to society to examine its unfairness that would drive folks to self-medicate or to seek altered states. Again, I think there's this connection between seeking altered states within one's own body as a way to create altered states within the larger social body. The tradition of the bouffon, for instance, uses exaggerated, misshapen, deformed embodiment to mock the hypocrisy of the powerful, the non-disabled. The myth of the bouffon is that everyone who's been cast out of the kingdom to live in the swamps at the edge of town watches the king and all of the elites all year long, closely studies them, imitates them, gets excellent at imitating and mocking them. One day during the carnival, they're invited back into the king's own court to mock the king and the noblemen to their faces. They have to be extremely funny and charming as they critique the powerful, or they will be immediately stoned to death. So they're like the funniest, most charming outcasts ever. And if the bouffon performance goes well, they are rewarded with food and wine. And then when the king and the court go home, they retire to their lavish bed quarters and they reflect on what's happened. They realize they've been so humiliated, they feel so ashamed that the entire ruling class kills themselves, right? So this is like the ideal clown performance. And only then is a new society possible. So I've been thinking about what this would mean to a desire to kill off oneself, a desire to kill off the world that upon which we grew, and how this kind of connects to our relationship to the earth, to the soil, to the ground, to my burgeoning obsession with compost. I've been thinking a lot about how visible folks in my neighborhood in Kensington are using drugs, nodding off, and how the precarity of existence is embodied in this kind of anxiety around the possibility of falling, and how there are specifically ordinances to remove anyone from the sidewalk who is lying there, who is sitting there, who is standing there. So these are legal ordinances that can be traced back to what are called the ugly laws, to kind of remove any ugliness, perceived ugliness, from the city landscape, which makes any kind of rest in public, any sort of demonstrated non-productivity, a crime and liable to be removed. So again, it seems to me that this is a distraction from looking at the ways in which the state itself is unstable and liable to fall. The social body as a whole is liable to fall, and in fact, the way in which falling is important. Falling down, in fact, puts us in contact with the ground in a way that we can examine it. We can examine its toxins. And again, in Kensington, there's to me this very unsettling collision between metaphor and lived experience. It's also one of the most intoxicated sites in the entire country. So the ground itself is so poisonous that anything that grows there, it may be too poisonous to eat. So again, I've been thinking about how can we relate to the shit upon which everything is built in a way where we are in close contact with it, and in close contact with the way in which it poisons us, and we in fact perpetuate that harm, seeing as that is the ground from which we grew. So during quarantine, I essentially became obsessed with trash, dirt, garbage, talking about compost to the point where my roommates became both bored and disgusted. I tried to convince my parents to compost, and my father essentially said, I have never been so deeply revolted as when I looked in the compost. And I just started kind of meditating on this revulsion, on this sense of being revolted, and on what revolting truly is, that people sitting, lying down, gathering, resting, sleeping in land that is supposedly not theirs in these encampments is considered revolting, and in fact is revolting. That the true revolt is simply to rest in space that is not yours, to come in contact with the ground, is this mode of revolting that is now, I think, thankfully more visible than before. But I also feel very tired. So in looking back on these notes from 2016, I felt a sense of exhaustion, of myself wanting to sleep, to go dormant, to be like a seed, like a little seed in a bed and sleep. I am a clown, but I have no audience anymore, which is fine because it gives me more time to think about things like dirt, like wanting to breaking down, wanting to help things break down, wanting things to break down more quickly, but also needing to have patience. Things will break down at the rate that they will break down. We can help them along, but essentially I'm obsessed with compost, and I'm horrified by the things that refuse to break down. Plastic bags, I'm obsessed with plastic bags, yogurt containers, cat food tins, period pads, these toxic things that just stay with us despite all our attempts at healing alchemy. And if they don't break down, there's this compulsion to transform them as much as possible immediately. Plastic bags into baskets, yogurt containers into plant labels, cat food tins as the legs of a table, period pads, perhaps a bloody pillow for a fairy. Everyone I know is becoming concerned. I'm surrounded by heaps. My heaps are everywhere. I can't stop talking about compost. Everyone in my pod wants me to be quiet. They all feel disgusted when they look at the compost. The compost is moving because there's so many bugs in it. It's alive. The compost is alive. The ground if it's healthy, is actually moving. To be in proximity to the ground is also to be in proximity to small movements of mass movements that are made of small movements, because actually the word clown comes from the word clod, which is related to the word clay. It's about forming through being formless, through being formless, forming through being formless. And that's really, I guess, the most poetic thing I can think of, is that compost is that. It's something that can happen in your hands, to be so in touch with the breaking apart, the putting together, compost, compose, to make composite, to put together by helping break apart. Being a dirtbag, being a clod, always saying the wrong thing. What a clod, what a clod. Now is the time for clods. So I don't want to be a clown anymore. I want to be a clod. I don't want to till, I don't want to work the land, I don't want to break up the land, I just want it all to break down. Lumpy, just be a lumpy, clumsy lump, just a clumping lump, just semi-formed, in praise of the semi-formed, of the in-between, of the not yet, of the always, almost, but never quite, totally, ever finished. The news is really bad, but the newspaper can just go in the compost. There's bacteria in the soil that actually has an effect on you that is better than Prozac. This is a study that I read today, because I was feeling like a cat lady, but not like a cat lady, like a compost lady. I just wanted to be near to it all the time. And in fact, there's a bacteria in there that is better than Prozac. So the smiling face of the clown clod maybe will not be so scary, because in fact, it will not be so much of a lie. You can piss on the newspapers, and then the newspaper is the carbon and the piss is the nitrogen, and you just piss on the news and it actually becomes compost, and then you can plant something, and then you can grow food in that, from the scraps, like Harlequin's costume is just made of scraps. All right, I guess I'll stop there. Yeah, thanks.
Wow, thank you. That became a poem. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
Gorgeous. I just want to say that I was inspired to make a compost after your videos. So I've got one too, and it's pretty gross, but I love it too. It's really smelly and a lot of creatures.
Yes, exactly.
It just filled up the first bin today, so I'm gonna put it aside now.
Let it rest.
Yeah, letting it rest. Okay, so the first part of this discussion is between the two talkers and Jerry and I. Jerry, do you have a question for either of these folks? And same with you too, if you guys have a question for each other.
Yeah, I guess, these two talks actually seem very apt for each other. It feels like both of you are talking about troubling rigid borders in different ways, and liquefying our thinking, troubling thinking, mixing things. And I guess my first question maybe on that is for Cecil. I wonder, in the way that your work is questioning borders, and to me that's happening visually with the maybe, for a lack of a better word, I would say chance-based creations that you're using with water and melt. Maybe a better word than chance is a kind of collaboration with water and with melting ice. And the way that you're talking about kind of water as something unbordered, and by being fluid, changing shape, and the law being something very bordered and treating everything as solid. And then there's sort of the interesting conundrum of the fact that the image itself is bordered. And I'm not only talking about the yellow border you put inside of it, but the fact that the image has to stop at some point. And I guess I wonder how you think about that, how you think about the edge of the image, what's beyond the edge of the image, and how that relates to what feels like a call towards a liquefaction of thought.
That's such a good question, Jerry. And Alex, you said this thing, the fear of the ambiguous, and I feel like that's what ties us together in this really nice way. And I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of how we decide when somebody's sick or not in terms of coronavirus, right? That there's this binary that they have it, they don't have it, but in fact, there's, of course, it's a gradient, as everything is, but it's so helpful for us to demarcate these points so that we can move forward, right? That we need to have some way of understanding lines so that we can set up a system around it. And not necessarily, I don't know if that's always a terrible thing, right? Except that we always need to remember that it is a human construct that made it a binary and that it doesn't exist without that. And so that's the part that I feel like gets lost because we move forward so much with the idea that it is this thing rather than understanding that we've defined the object as it is. And then in terms of the work itself, I guess, and the boundaries, I feel like that was a really good question that I don't actually have an answer to. A lot of it is that I'm seeking to find that tension between something that doesn't look like it should have borders and then creating borders, I guess. And that is part of the concept. But I think a bigger piece for me, and the reason I like doing these things, is that it feels entirely intuitive, and that I'm letting all of the thoughts out of my brain. And while I've read all the things I've read and I've written all the things I've written, I just don't want to do that while I'm trying to make these. And so that's this nice part to just see where they go, and then often find out that I understood more in that process than I did in the process that I was conscious of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How does that? Oh, sorry. Go on.
You go.
I was going to ask Alex how intuition works in your creative process as being a performance artist.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was reading about water this morning, so I was really excited to hear your work around that, like thinking about flow, and I'm very interested in nothing as a concept. And I was just reading like about water not trying to do something, just just being, and then actually getting a lot done, or having quite a strong force. And I don't know, I'm very confused about process right now, but I think in terms of intuition, I try to like trust associative thinking, I guess, not like forcing a connection myself, but trusting that, to use more water metaphors, like things come to the surface that want to reveal themselves at that time, due to various eddies and whatnot. But it's really hard to have that like trust in intuition. Like I don't feel that I have a strong sense of intuition, but rather must force myself to trust. And I was thinking about that a lot, just like gathering some of these thoughts together. A lot of that is in the body part of the body rather than the mind part of the body, like sound and shape, and following those connections and linkages. So I was thinking a lot about the word clod, and like if we had more time or we were all in the same place, we could try an experiment right now. I was curious like how people would translate the word clod into a movement. Like if you were translating from a linguistic system to a movement system, how would you translate clod? Maybe we could all try right now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's try it. Yeah.
So just to do a real quickie, I'll say the word clod, and then we'll take a breath in and out, and then just like make the shape that you think the sound clod would translate to. So not the concept clod, but the sound clod. Okay. Claude. Whoa, interesting. Cool. Cool. Do you all get to see each other a little bit too, right? Yeah. Yeah, interesting. There's so much in that. What were you gonna say, Anna?
Oh no, because I was just been thinking that another like connection that you guys have already stated between your two talks was like about movement and movement defying clarity, like movement being a part of chaos, and also like being a place that like legal and like linguistic and other things can't hold on to. So I was thinking about your practice also including movement in the poetry too, that your like body is creating the shapes of these words and thoughts. And so I was happy that you brought us a physical exercise, one that I do many times with my students. I love asking people to make shapes with their bodies. But since we have such a small group, I thought we could just open it up more quickly. If anyone has other questions or comments or thoughts or exercises they want to try, please unmute yourself.
I have like a barely formed question for Cecil around like just thinking about toxicity in water and like in relation to earth, I suppose, since I've really been chewing on this question of like how different elements hold on to poisons or let go of them or like act as cleansing and healing agents or don't like act as poisoning agents. And I don't know if you have any thinking around that in terms of like your work with containment. Do you know what I mean? If that sparks anything for you.
I mean, and my answer is probably not that full, but I have been thinking about that a lot. I've been using a lot of like ferrous salts in my work. Actually, Anna, you were talking about irons, how you're getting irons to do your dyeing, and I'm really fascinated by the prospect of hand making things partially so that you understand its toxicity. Like I don't think it always takes it away from it, but you're like engaged with the toxicity in a different way. And I think that part of seeing that movement is really important to me. But I also feel like, I'm going to try and articulate this, but the part where I feel like there's another overlap in this idea of the earth being something that's like scary, but it's also this, as you were talking about, like your compost is like breaking these things down. It's like, it's reinventing basically the material, and in some way that's what the soil is doing to the surface water as it's coming through. It's like reinventing that as clean water, and then it goes to this aquifer. And so I think there's this really interesting parallel in terms of like what that body of earth does. And I loved how you said the fear of falling is like what we're so scared about in these clowns, that fear of like tumbling into something that we don't know. It's such a beautiful idea.
Yeah, it's amazing thinking about ritual. I guess that image came to mind for me in just what you just said, like the role of water as this baptismal element, but then like earth actually having the chance to baptize the water itself, like somehow.
Yeah, totally.
I don't have a question yet, really, but I'm gonna like share a couple things your guys' talks are making me think about, and like I think a question will arise, hopefully. Just this idea of toxicity and also like kind of visibilizing that is making me think of this book by Eula Biss called On Immunity, and she talks about how actually like a lot of things are toxic and that we've demonized the word toxic. And she talks about it in relation to yeah, viruses and immunization and vaccines, and then she's also someone who writes about whiteness and like white racial identity. And somehow I'm hearing, so that's like one thing that came up. And then also like more in Alex's talk when you were, or both your talks honestly, like, but when you were talking about composting and the clown, and I'm thinking about commedia and like inheritances of European performance practice that I don't know that history so well, but I'm also right now revisiting Silvia Federici's book Caliban and the Witch, which is about medieval spiritual practice in like the 13th and 14th centuries that was basically quelled in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And so, okay, these are my 3 notes. And then the third note that came up. And then also somehow what you guys were just talking about, this like, that these things that we can't see is also reminding me of Edouard Glissant, who's a post-colonial thinker from Martinique. He talks about opacity and this, basically that like, and he uses it in a racialized way, but to also understand that like, oh, an enlightenment, we've like inherited this enlightenment tendency towards transparency, and that actually we should all be allowed to be opaque, that we all have the right to opacity. And somehow I guess I'm thinking about like, maybe that's where my question is, like, in a lot of ways, like maybe Alex more through performance and Cecil more through visual art making, you're visibilizing some of these invisible things, but it doesn't necessarily feel to me like it's in the vein of this enlightenment transparency model. Like it feels like you're actually going against that. And I guess I'm just curious, like how you think about your role as an artist, like in relation to visibility and invisibility and these unseen forces and things. This is a weird question, but yeah, this is where I land. I guess I'm also asking this as people in the US inheriting certain European practices. Like I'm curious about the long view of your fields and some of these colonial inheritances.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about Federici's work on land and how present that is for me. Like she writes about the very deliberate fencing off of what had been the commons, and we're still really living in the shadow of that grand hoax of being taught all these violent lies about land, that it is ours, that it isn't ours. And I feel that very strongly on a day-to-day basis, that I navigate that in New York, where I was born and raised, that it is my city, and it also very much is not my city. In these various different ways, and the difficulty, how difficult it is to live for everyone, but also more so for some people, and finding the best way to like do solidarity, not just like claim or say one is in solidarity, but really live in that fully, and also with joy. So that's something that is like very present for me, figuring out what that means and will look like and feel like. And I guess a lot of my work has been about feeling that even in a more heightened way when I step on a stage, because the stage is so charged. It's my body on stage in a place that is often funded by money that is even bloodier than most money. And now there's something quite exciting, I think, about the collapse of so many industries that I relied upon to make space for me to then take up space, which was something that I felt very conflicted about. But I think there is like a chance now for a very joyous dismantling of the structures that made that kind of feel like the only way it was possible to make work. And I hope that maybe we can just stop making work altogether and in fact like play in a different space, like find a space for a different kind of playing with each other. Yeah, which will not always be fun, you know, but I think ultimately is such a celebratory possibility to dismantle the yeah, the shit that we're trapped by and also perpetuate as a white person. Yeah.
I have a question for Cecil. Cecil, what made you transition from going to be a landscape architect rather, which is someone, I presume is somebody who in some ways manipulates the land, right? And takes it to be, well, just manipulates the land, okay? And I think of someone like an artist like Robert Smithson, who made like the spiral jetty or things like that. And now you're doing something so fascinating where you're more like observing the existing land, and then you're fabricating art from your observations of what exists and the beauty of what currently exists, rather than manipulating the land, the earth itself. You follow me? So what made you take that leap?
That's such an interesting point. I was working on a resiliency study out in the Bay Area for climate change work, and it was about trying to find areas, locations, cities, people that could enact change in advance of the sea levels rising and the many effects that will have on that region. And it was kind of a disaster of a project, and it really got me thinking about what it is, why we end up always having the same conversations in planning meetings. And in general, like it feels like it's stuck in this cycle where like nothing really is moving forward. And that was 2 years ago. I do actually feel like something's changing now, but at the moment it was so frustrating, and it felt so much like the answers of what we need to do in the built environment are very simple. You know, it's build these horizontal levees. It's like there's a whole toolkit, but getting people to reimagine place in a way that actually works with that is much harder. And so I wanted to kind of get back to some of the issues as to why our places look like they look. And how can we start to reimagine the origins of those and think of it in a different way. And that's kind of uncovering like these weird arcane laws, but also like just thinking about, you know, Jefferson's grid that has informed everything in our country. You know, it's just so omnipresent, especially in the West, and it's caused just an immense amount of disaster from it. And how can we like even begin to start to think about that and how we might move forward, knowing that that's like at the basis of what we have here. And you know, it's one of those tricky things where it's like I sometimes am like, did I just like bow out because it was hard? And it's like a lot easier to just sit back and question things. But I do feel like it's really important to kind of take those longer views and try and figure out ways that we can communicate that more broadly. So that was sort of the hope.
No, I think it's great. Thank you.
I think it's so interesting how you said, I think I quoted it, but maybe I didn't. But just that like, that we have to like go back to the natural conditions often to figure out like what's right. As even in the law, and in that case you were citing. And I think it like makes me think of falling also, like, and falling to dirt. And try like figuring out what is right by returning to the shit that we live on, as Alex says. So do I have a question there? Not yet. So if anyone has something to jump in, please do.
I have a question, which I'll pose to Alex, and maybe Cecil will also figure out how it's also for her, because I'm sure it is. Which is, Alex, you were talking about the clown as an altered state, and talking, at least as I'm understanding it in slightly different terminology, a kind of utopian possibility in that altered state. And the altered states you're talking about in general, of like there's a possibility for a different way of living that necessarily challenges hegemonic power structures, dominant ways of being and living. And I guess I'm thinking about that term altered state and thinking about it in terms of, well, altered to what, right? Of course, it's altered to whatever the dominant structure is. And so the very maybe impossible question I want to ask you is about how, in maybe just circumscribing it to clown practice, but maybe you don't have to do that. How can the practice of an altered state make possibility as opposed to reinscribe that which is normative, dominant, ordinary?
Well, the thing that comes to mind for me is the Genesis Peorage exhibit, Alter Everything, but spelled ALTAR, which I think is sort of the key. Like the clown puns on reality. And that seems really crucial to me, that we make our worlds in many ways, but in one way is through words, and the remaking of the world word can also happen at the level of language and how we choose to describe things to ourselves and to each other. And I think we're in a very exciting moment of living with the power of discourse and really seeing things change at the level of language, but not only at the level of language. Language as a real one avenue towards remaking our lived experiences together. So just thinking about altering rather than altering is really helpful to me. And when we think about that in a physical sense, like not trying to change something, which is another mode of like this kind of fascistic artist thing that I sometimes recognize in myself, my inner Karen artist, whatever, that we must not kill, but just welcome into a different mode. But you know, like wanting to change things according to my vision, which I don't think is really helpful or really any different. It's not a real altering then. It's just like another mode of trying to exert control. And so to alter feels richer and also more pleasurable, and also like more filled with possibility, that instead of altering, it's in fact offering, like making a space for offerings, which I think also kind of links back into some of these things we've both been saying, like around liquid and drinking, and kind of like recognizing the body as a vessel that things come in and out of, and that are part of this process of like offering and also being able to receive, and kind of, yeah, Genesis Peorage's pun on altering everything is really helpful. Responding to your question from like clown logic, I guess.
That made me think of I was just listening to a talk with Jad Abumrad, I think I'm saying his name right, but where he produced the Dolly Parton's America. I don't know if you all listened to that. It was so good. And was talking about what the meaning of that was to him, in terms of like Radiolab used to focus a lot on like science and scientific discoveries, and he started to get kind of dissatisfied with that way of presenting the world and wanting to find things that were more ambiguous. and then started to get dissatisfied with how much like ambiguity there is in the world. And so the Dolly Parton's America, he was explaining how important that was to him in terms of trying to find a third, where it's like, if you imagine two people in conversation, if they're really authentically engaging with each other, they actually create a third thing in the room that's different than what the two people have thought of. And so like, I think what you were saying, Alex, is so important in terms of like not trying to persuade somebody else of your point, and not even trying to hear or have them persuade you of their point, but to create this other thing through art seems like the kind of the highest, I don't know, goal. Is that the right word? Something like that.
Cecile, I have a question about kind of what you're talking about with allowing things to come together in conversation and allowing for kind of these like incidental things to happen, and how that relates to the process of specifically using printmaking in your work. I'm a printmaker myself, and I also do a lot of monoprinting. So I'm a little bit familiar with that, but I'm just curious specifically how you think about that with your work.
Well, like I was saying with Jerry, it feels like it's this nice part of me that gets to be very intuitive. I think having been trained in design school, everything needed to have a reason behind it, and you had to like explain it and accrue it to somebody. And that's fine. It's good practice to learn, but it doesn't necessarily lead you to think outside of what your own mind can produce. And so I've been just really interested in seeing ways of making that are completely just like responding to the materials and how they start to form, and then I interact on top of that, and then they interact on top of me, and so it becomes a dialogue with, you know, a pigment rather than a dialogue in my brain. And so that's kind of that process of printmaking, and a lot of it has to do with letting materials just move, and then sometimes I draw on top of it, and then sometimes it is garbage. A lot of times it's garbage. And then every once in a while, sometimes I like it.
Wonderful. So I think we probably have time. If there's any other questions burning in the audience, would love to hear any other, maybe time for one more question or comment, and then we'll move to towards wrapping up. Kate, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. I again, I don't know if it's like a question so much as a sort of like meandering toward a question. But I was so struck in both of your pieces by the way that language was functioning, by the way that Cecil, your piece was examining the ways in which law is looking for a kind of declarative language, or a language that that defines a boundary, that pursues a boundary, even in the midst of a kind of nebulous, like a nebulous subject. And then Alex, in the way that you were drawing so deeply on a kind of associative language, and the ways in which like one word leads to the next, in which like word histories can reveal these kind of subterranean connections. And so it felt like your two talks were presenting sort of portraits of language, like two different ways that language can function for us as a kind of laboratory or a space for investigating different ways of being in community, like a version of being in community that is committed to the definition of boundaries, and the kind of and to defining different to defining rules, to making rules, and then a kind of being in community that is interested in deterioration and in revolt and in and so I was interested in seeing those two living alongside each other, and thinking about like how can language work for us in those different ways. But I'm not really sure where the question, I mean, yeah, so it's maybe more of an observation, but.
That's a beautiful observation. I love that idea of the subterranean roots of Alex's work, because it is so playful, and like I think I was trying to find the humor in the language of law, but I feel like Alex, you showed me a whole new way of finding humor in language tonight, which was really lovely and beautiful.
I have one last. Oh, Alex, do you want to speak?
Go for it.
Okay, I was just thinking, like, the way you brought up community there made me think about both like Cecil's work, like with doing environmental activism work in the Bay, and then also Alex, the way you talked about like figuring out how to actually be in solidarity in tangible ways versus like representational ways through art. And I was just thinking how that like that model of like deteriorating together and like failing together and falling together could be a cool model in community organizing. And like I think often when we're like you were saying, it's like so hard to do community organizing because it often feels like it's like this, like stopping. And I think I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about like that structure also politically working with the community and also like within friends or like any group dynamics in that sense. I don't know if that was really articulate, but.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that I wanted to bring up this figure in response to Elena, your mention of glissant and opacity, and just thinking about opacity and transparency in connection to a lot of the themes people have been raising. But so this figure of the Pierrot Grenade, have you heard of him? They're like this Trinidadian clown carnival character. The main sort of act being spelling, like they're an incredible speller of words, but they spell words through stories. So each letter is a story. And this is so amazing to me because it's this kind of mocking the expert, but also sharing a lot of expertise, like again, through a different lens, and also thinking about law and examining the language of law. Like, what if you really took it at its name or something and really studied the letter of the law? Like, yeah, sure, I'll follow the law down to the very letter of the law, and then just kind of broke it apart because in fact you're interpreting the law according to pieces and kind of like according to fragment and sort of shattering it that way and like reading letter by letter as its own kind of image story. And of course this figure is doing this virtuosic language tricksterism in Creole. And so there's this like powerful history of rebellion also inside the language and this particular relationship to breaking apart the language and to opacity, to kind of like hiding many layers of stories inside this sort of linguistic analysis. So I don't know, I just wanted to share that, like that image of this clown who also draws from so many different histories and influences indigenous to the Americas, and the comedy figures and the Pierrot of France, and also griot traditions. And so it's like this, this tactic of reading so closely that, and so kind of physically with one's language, that you discover totally new textures seems really exciting in the work that you're doing, Cecil, and kind of in the sorts of questions people are asking, you know?
Yeah, I feel like it's in that like very close examination of anything, it starts to fall apart, right? And that there's just like, instead of letting that be a scary thing, it becomes like a real moment of beauty. Even if you think of like a computer screen, right? You zoom into a raster image so much and it becomes a grid, and that's like, we're always trying to like frame the resolution to the right way or look at things at the scale that they're supposed to be presented at. But when you blow that apart, you get all sorts of new ideas.
Well, I think we probably have time for just a round of final thoughts. So I wonder, Cecil and Alex, and really anybody present, if there's like one final thing that is on your mind that you'd like to say, maybe that you came here intending to say that you didn't say, or that feels like, you know, the seed that's just germinating its last little sprout above our composted soil here.
I just love Anna saying that she started a compost and that it's wriggly and smelly. And I think that's so great. And may ye all go forth and compost is my takeaway. And like, email me if you need support or have specific questions, because like I really love to talk about it, as you can tell, in the concrete as well as in the poetical. And yeah, thank you all for being here. It's been really lovely.
I don't have any other final thoughts, but thank you so much, Jerry and Anna, for hosting, and everybody for coming.
Does anyone else want to share a thought? Okay, great. We have time. Alex and Cecil, would you guys like to plug anything, like an organization or something going on in your life that you want this group of people to know?
Well, I'm living between Brooklyn and Philadelphia right now, and it's so lovely getting government unemployment, and I am able to do things non-work related for possibly the first time in my adult life. So I am doing a lot more organizing with gardens and composting programs in both of those cities. As a lot of you may know, I suppose the New York City composting program was very amazing and growing, and the budget was slashed from 25 million to 2.5 million. So there's kind of like a great need for volunteers to get involved in learning to compost yourself in your home or in your backyard, and also in organizing your neighbors and getting folks that you live nearby to also get excited about composting. So I think this is really great. I think that's the most like efficient way to do it, is just do it yourself in your home or your backyard and get folks that you talk to excited. So there's just so many organizations working on that in New York, Save Our Compost and BK Rot. And I'll change my thingy here to my Instagram, because I just post about this stuff all the time, and sometimes also do funny videos if I have the energy. So you're welcome to follow me there and hear me proselytize more.
The only thing I can think of right now is the Underland, the Robert McFarlane book, which I don't know if you've already read, Alex, but it's all about like our relationship to the underworld. And it's beautiful and like everything that you want from a book. And I think he's an incredible storyteller. And I would recommend for everybody to read that and think about Earth that way.
Cool.
Thank you. That's amazing. Also, I'm going to plug again for the millionth time my mutual aid network, Kensington Windsor Terrace Mutual Aid. We are in constant need of funds to help feed the growing population of people who are suffering under COVID, particularly undocumented folks who don't get any government aid and are having a hard time accessing food and rent money, stuff like that. So I put the link into the chat. And then finally, our next Talk Flock is July 21st at 7:30 p.m. EST. Talk Flockers, talkers are to be determined. Do we have any officials yet, Jerry?
Yeah, Joe.
We do.
Is multi-hyphenate musician Joe Kai is going to do some like improvisatory, participatory things using audience feedback to create sound loops, which would be a lot of fun, I think.
Dope. And I think our other speaker is likely going to talk about abolitionist work. So we have 2 folks into that. So please come back in, and we want to see you guys in 2 weeks, and tell your friends or whoever might be interested.
Yeah, and just to clarify, it's Tuesday, the 21st. We're changing the date, just, to make it more confusing. But thank you all for spending this night with us. This has been really, really wonderful. Cecil, Alex, thank you both for the fabulous talks. I have a lot to continue tilling and composting in my nitrogen-rich mind. All right, we hope to see you all in 2 weeks.
Thank you all. Rest up.
Thank you.
Bye.
The other plug I would make is for Alex. Do you know the book Trickster Makes This World? Oh, you're muted.
I haven't read it. Trickster
Oh,
Makes This World.
Trickster Makes This World by let me look it up right now. It's the best. Lewis Hyde, who also wrote the book,
Yeah.
which is so fabulous. It's
Cool.
all about like kind of the trickster as abject figure from outside who like who through the use of dirt creates new world order. It's like marvelous.
So relevant. Thank you for the rec. Thank you both so much.
Yeah,
Thanks for doing this, Alex. Always wonderful. Also, I want to apologize for my dad emailing you.
Oh, no, please don't. Apologize. Why apologize? It's so exciting. Now I'm back. Now I can email. I was like, I'm away for a long time, but I'll talk to you when I get back. Then I forgot. I'm back.
You do not need to talk to him.
No, be very
he just
happy.
likes to chat about random things. If he thinks you're interested in them, he'll go after you.
That's so sweet. Cool. And also, yeah, I want to talk. You're in the neighborhood. I just got back to Lefferts.
Oh yeah.
So,
Welcome back.
yeah.
This crazy world.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about the mutual aid stuff and everything, whatever that's going on.
Oh yeah. Well, Jerry's gotten involved with Equity for Flatbush.
Oh, cool.
So, and FUMA, they're going sort of strong in your neighborhood, but like in the spirit of decomposing and breaking apart and falling all the time. All the mutual aids are going through, I think, an identity crisis.
Yeah.
And like returning to what's original, like thinking about what actually is mutual aid is causing everyone to kind of break apart.
Wow, interesting.
Which is probably good, but interesting moment.
Wow.
I don't know, Jerry, if you've experienced this yet.
I still feel like I'm trying to figure out how Equality for Flatbush works, honestly, and like what my involvement can be. So I feel like I'm still so on the periphery of it that I'm not seeing that crisis.
Yeah, well, they're probably going through something different because they're so black and brown led.
Yeah, and now there's like this huge influx of white people who want to help. And I think they're trying to figure out like, how do we use that energy? How do we organize and like educate these people and like onboard people? I feel like the organization is ballooning and that has all sorts of other problems with it.
And opportunities for
yes.
something exciting. Yeah, let's hang out. Elena and I are leaving for California, but then we'll be back.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
See you on the flip side.
What?
See you on the flip side.
See you on the flip side. Bye, Alex. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
So nice hanging out with you both. Bye.